The room is dimly lit. Heavy curtains block the evening light, and a dozen people sit shoulder to shoulder around a polished wooden table. No one speaks above a whisper. A woman twists a handkerchief in her lap. Across from her sits a man who lost his son the previous winter. Since the funeral, he has searched for reassurance wherever he could find it. Ministers, books, prayer, nothing has given him what he wants most. One more conversation. At the head of the table sit two young women, the Fox sisters. One of them asks everyone to join hands, and the room falls silent. "Is there a spirit present?" she says softly. "Give us a sign." A moment passes. Then, the sound is sharp and unmistakable. Several people straighten in their chairs. Another knock follows. Then another. Questions are asked. Answers arrive through mysterious raps and taps that seem to come from nowhere. Is there a spirit present? Do you have a message for someone in this room? A woman begins to cry. Others lean forward, hanging on every sound. For a brief moment, death itself seems less certain. The boundary between the living and the dead appears thinner than anyone imagined. And everyone gathered around the table wants the same thing. Not proof, not science, not certainty. Hope. The hope that the people they love are still somehow within reach. The hope that goodbye might not really be goodbye. The hope of one more conversation. This is Death Becomes Her, and I'm your host, Layla Kelly. The séance I just described took place during the rise of the spiritualist movement in the mid-19th century. The Fox sisters would become some of the most famous mediums in America. Their séances helped launch a movement that attracted millions of followers. Some participants were grieving parents, some were widows, some were prominent public figures, some were scientists. Today, many of the methods used by mediums have been exposed as tricks and deceptions. We'll come back to that later. But before we dismiss the people gathered around those séance tables, it's worth asking why so many intelligent people wanted to believe. The answer wasn't gullibility. It was grief. And that brings us to the present day. Today, we're talking about AI. And I know, even saying those two letters out loud can make people brace a little. The pace of AI is dizzying. It feels like every few months there is a new tool that can do something that we never even imagined a machine could do. And most of us are somewhere between curious and unsettled, sometimes in the very same breath. I'm not here to tell you that AI is good or bad. I'm here because it's already showing up in one of the most human rooms there is, grief. I'm also bringing it up because I have so many questions, so many what-ifs that I'd like to run by you. And whatever we feel about the technology in general, I think it's worth sitting with what it means when it starts making promises about the people we've lost. So let's start with a scenario. Not a headline, not a statistic, just a moment, the kind that's already happening in living rooms right now. Imagine that your significant other died 3 years ago. One evening, your phone buzzes. A text message pops up. The words sound like them. The humor sounds like them. The phrases are familiar. The message arrives exactly the way thousands of their messages arrived before. You know that your loved one is dead. You know this is artificial intelligence. So why does your heart race when you read it? This isn't science fiction. Companies already offer services that can preserve a person's voice, create interactive avatars, and generate conversations using a deceased person's digital traces. One early example was Hereafter AI. It was designed to be a dynamic oral history project. While it was operating, people could record stories, memories, and answers to common questions while they were alive. After they died, family members could ask questions and hear the person's own recorded voice response. The company grew out of founder James Vlahos's desire to preserve conversations with his terminally ill father. Although Hereafter AI has since shut down, it illustrates an important distinction. It wasn't inventing new responses, it was retrieving stories that had already been recorded. StoryFile takes that same basic idea even further. You sit for an interview, cameras record you from multiple angles, often against a green screen. You answer several hundred questions, and after your death, the system responds using your actual face and your actual voice. But again, it isn't generating new speech on the fly. It's searching a library of your pre-recorded answers and playing back the one that best matches the question. StoryFile functions more like a remarkably organized video archive than a mind that is being brought back to life. And then there are services that work differently, built from the digital traces you've already left behind. Séances AI is one current example. Family members can upload text messages, voicemails, emails, videos, social media posts, and other personal materials. The system uses those to model your language, your personality, and your conversational style. The starting material isn't a recording session created expressly for this purpose. It's your existing digital legacy. And from that, it generates new responses. Not remembered, not pre-recorded, generated. Which means the person responding is not quite the person who died. It's a model trained on that person, a very convincing echo. But here's where it gets complicated. There's a meaningful difference between a person who is alive, who has chosen deliberately, thoughtfully to sit down and preserve their voice, their stories, their sense of humor, their way of seeing the world. Someone who gives informed consent to become eventually a digital artifact. Someone who decides what is included, what is left out, and what version of themselves they want to leave behind. That is one thing. It is something else entirely when a model is built from the digital traces of a life. Text messages that were sent in passing, emails dashing off in a hurry, social media posts never intended to become a legacy, assembled after death to serve the needs of the living. One is an act of authorship, the other is reconstruction, and reconstruction has its limits. Let's spend a moment on those limits. A griefbot is, at its core, a statistical model. It doesn't remember, it doesn't understand, it predicts. When the conversation stays close to things your loved one actually said or wrote, the responses can feel remarkably authentic. The cadence is right, the humor lands, the familiar turns of phrase are there. But eventually, the conversation moves beyond what the person ever had the chance to say. What do you think of my new job? Should I sell the house? Do you forgive me? Those aren't memories waiting to be retrieved. They're questions the model has to answer for the first time. It does that the same way every large language model does, by predicting which words are most likely to come next based on everything it has learned from the material it was given. Most of the time, those predictions may sound very convincing. Sometimes they may even be comforting, but they are still predictions. AI researchers use the word hallucination when a model confidently invents information that isn't true. A griefbot doesn't have to hallucinate to become something else. Every response it generates is, to some degree, an inference. And the farther the conversation moves from your dead loved one's actual words and experiences, the more these inferences begin to shape the person you're talking to. Slowly, without any announcement or warning, the conversation can drift. The rough edges may soften. The contradictions that made your person human may disappear. The difficult days may quietly fade away. What you're left with may not be the person exactly, but a version of them. Coherent, comforting, conversational, and increasingly shaped by what the model predicts they would have said, rather than what they actually did. And that raises another question. At what point does an echo stop being an echo and become something else entirely? We don't have the long-term evidence to know. These technologies are still too new. But that's exactly why these questions matter now, not years from now, after millions of people have woven them into the way they grieve. There's another concept that keeps coming to mind: the uncanny valley. In robotics and animation, the uncanny valley describes that unease that we feel when something appears almost human, but not quite. It's close enough to feel familiar, yet different enough that something feels off. I wonder whether Grief AI creates its own kind of uncanny valley, not in the appearance, but in the relationship. Imagine a mother who is always patient, a spouse who never has a bad day, a friend who never disagrees with you, a child who never grows older than your memory of them. At first, that might feel comforting. Over time, it might begin to feel strangely incomplete, because the people that we love are not remembered only for their kindness, they're remembered for their quirks, their contradictions, their bad moods, their rough edges, the very things that made them fully human. If those imperfections slowly disappear, what remains may feel more pleasant, but it may also become less true. And that raises another question. Is this preservation? Or is it a portrait painted to comfort the person who survived? The person it most resembles, is that really who they were? Or is it who we need them to be? Maybe that's why this technology is so fascinating. Whatever these services are called, they all offer some version of the same promise. One more conversation. At first glance, it's easy to understand that appeal. For thousands of years, humans have searched for ways to maintain relationships with the dead. In the 19th century, spiritualism provided communication through mediums and séances. Today, we keep photographs, save letters, visit graves, preserve treasured possessions, or sometimes we find ourselves speaking to someone we've lost long after they're gone. Modern grief theory recognizes much of this as healthy. The theory of continuing bonds suggests that grieving doesn't require us to sever our relationship with the dead. The relationship continues, it simply changes. We carry our dead with us, in our memories, in our stories, in our habits, in the advice that we still hear in our heads years after someone is gone. Maybe griefbots are simply the newest expression of something humans have always done. But there is one profound difference. A photograph doesn't answer back. A letter doesn't write a new paragraph. A voicemail doesn't tell a story that was never recorded. But artificial intelligence does. And the moment our memories begin talking back to us, the nature of the relationship changes entirely. I want to tell you about a conversation I had a few years ago with a friend whose 10-year-old daughter had died in an accident. I had been reading about these technologies, and I asked her what she thought of them, whether she would ever consider interacting with a virtual version of her daughter. She thought about it for a moment, and then she said that she would be afraid to. Not because she thought it was necessarily wrong, but because she missed her daughter so much that she didn't trust herself with it. She was afraid that if she stepped into that world, she might not come back out, that she would choose it again and again over the harder work of learning how to live without her little girl. She knew something important about herself in that moment. She knew how vulnerable she was, and she knew that her love for her daughter was exactly the thing that could be her undoing. I think about that conversation often because grief doesn't make us weak, but it does make us vulnerable. And vulnerability isn't a character flaw. It's part of loving someone so deeply that losing them changes the shape of your life. And that vulnerability is precisely what these products are designed to enter. There is a federal regulation that most people have never heard of. It's called the Funeral Rule. In 1984, the Federal Trade Commission implemented a set of consumer protections specifically for people arranging funerals. The rule requires funeral homes to provide itemized, transparent pricing. It prohibits certain deceptive practices. It gives consumers the right to choose only the goods and services they actually want, rather than being sold packages that they don't need. On the surface, that sounds straightforward. But the reason that it exists in the first place is worth noting. The FTC didn't create the funeral rule because funeral directors couldn't be trusted. Most funeral professionals are doing difficult, meaningful work, often during some of the hardest moments in people's lives. The rule exists because lawmakers recognize something that grief workers have always known. People arranging funerals are not typical consumers. They are exhausted. They are heartbroken. They are often making significant financial decisions for the first time in an industry that they know nothing about, under time pressure, while in shock. Grief affects cognition. It affects judgment. It affects our ability to evaluate information clearly and advocate for ourselves. And so we decided as a society that people in that condition deserved additional protection. Not because they're weak, because the circumstances are extraordinary. Now consider grief AI. The funeral rule doesn't apply to griefbots. It doesn't apply to voice cloning services. It doesn't apply to digital avatars or AI companions modeled on the dead. And yet, these products are being marketed to the same population that federal regulation already recognizes as potentially vulnerable: people in mourning. The regulatory framework that protects a grieving person from being pressured into buying an expensive casket has nothing to say about a platform charging a monthly subscription fee for access to a digital version of the person they've lost. We thought carefully about the first one. We've barely begun to think about the second. And that raises more questions that become even more important when we consider what we already know about human relationships with artificial intelligence. People become attached to AI. This isn't speculation. Researchers have already documented emotional attachments forming with AI companions, therapeutic chatbots, and conversational systems. People describe these technologies as friends, confidants, and sources of comfort. Human beings are extraordinarily capable of forming emotional bonds. Now, imagine replacing a generic chatbot with your deceased spouse, or your mother, or your child. The emotional stakes change dramatically. And perhaps the most important question is not whether these systems provide comfort, because many undoubtedly do. The more difficult question is whether comfort is always the same thing as healing. Grief is painful, but grief is also adaptive. Part of mourning involves learning how to live in a world that has been permanently altered. The relationship continues, but in a new form. What happens if technology continually recreates the sensation of presence? What happens if the dead remain perpetually available? What happens if every moment of longing can be answered by opening an app? We don't yet know the answers, but these are questions worth asking now, because for thousands of years, the wish has been the same. One more conversation. A séance lasted an evening. A letter had an ending. A voicemail eventually stopped playing, but a grief bot doesn't have to say goodbye. And that changes the nature of the experience, especially when profit enters the picture. Historically, mourning rituals were shaped by families, communities, and spiritual traditions. Grief bots are often created by companies. Companies measure engagement. Companies seek growth. Companies benefit when customers continue using their products. Those incentives do not automatically mean companies will act unethically, but they do mean we should ask whether commercial incentives always align with what is healthiest for a grieving person. If a grief bot helps someone heal and eventually stop using the service, is that good business? Would a company build a product designed to help you say goodbye, or one designed to keep the conversation going? Would an AI ever encourage someone to spend less time with it? Would it suggest calling your sister instead? Maybe a friend for coffee, joining a grief support group, closing the app? We don't know. But those are questions worth asking before we build an industry around relationships with the dead. And now we return to the Fox sisters. We know today that the mysterious raps and knocks that were heard in the darkened rooms were not messages from the dead. In 1888, Margaret Fox confessed publicly that the sounds had been a trick, produced by, of all things, snapping her toe joints against the floor. A simple physical deception that had filled the grief-stricken with hope and moved them to tears. It would be easy to dismiss those people as naive, but the people in those rooms were not foolish. Many were educated. Many were scientists and scholars and public figures. One of spiritualism's most devoted followers was Arthur Conan Doyle, the man who created Sherlock Holmes, arguably the most rational-minded in all fiction. It was the hope that drew people in. Even Fox Mulder had a poster on his wall. I want to believe. It turns out that's not a flaw. It's a human characteristic. They believed because they wanted to believe. Because grief has a way of making the impossible feel worth reaching for. Because the alternative, accepting that the people that they loved were simply gone, was unbearable. And someone was there to meet the need, for a price. That is what I keep returning to as I think about grief AI. Not whether the technology is sophisticated, it is. Not whether some people find genuine comfort in it, they do. But whether we have thought carefully enough about what it means to build a product whose value proposition is hope, whose entire market is heartbreak, whose ideal customer is someone whose judgment, by no fault of their own, may not be at its most clear. My friend knew something about herself that most of us don't want to admit. She knew that love, in the wrong vessel, could swallow her whole. She knew to be afraid of her own longing. That kind of self-knowledge is rare, and it is a lot to ask of someone in the early, raw days of loss, that they pause and evaluate and protect themselves from something that is offering them exactly what they want most. One more conversation. In 1848, people gathered around a table in a darkened room and waited for a knock. Today, they reach for their phones. The technology has changed. The longing has not. The Fox sisters weren't really selling messages from the dead. They were selling hope to people desperate for one more conversation. Nearly 2 centuries later, we're still asking the same thing of new technology. The names have changed, the tools have changed, but humans remain the same. So maybe the honest thing, the brave thing, isn't to search for another way to speak with the dead. Maybe it's to start talking about death while we're still alive. Before the knock, before the phone buzzes, before we're desperate enough to need either one. Remember, talking about death won't kill you. I promise. This has been Death Becomes Her. You can find me on Instagram at Leaving Well Death Doula or on TikTok as Death Doula Layela. As always, thanks for listening.